A man stepped off a slick crossbrace above the Golden Gate and fell straight toward the bay. Fog swallowing him, wind roaring in his ears. He should have died in silence. Instead, he hit a moving net that snapped like a giant hammock and threw him back into life. The bridge sold itself as a triumph of modern safety. So how did a job that could catch a falling man still end up defined by the day the catching failed? I'm James. Most people remember the Golden Gate Bridge as red steel, postcards and a ribbon cutting. The men who built it remember something else first. The gap. A mile of open air between two cliffs. Water below that doesn't forgive, and weather that changes its mind by the minute. They also remember the invention meant to prove this mega project could be different. A giant movable safety net hung beneath the work like a second sky. Before the towers looked like a bridge, they looked like scaffolds trying to stand up in wind. Catwalk planks flexed under boots. Rivet guns hammered like angry insects. Chains clanked. Cables sang. And the fog came in low enough to make the world feel unfinished. Up there, a man could lose the horizon and keep walking anyway, because stopping was how you got replaced. The net sat below the crews, stretched across the span like a dark promise. It wasn't delicate. It was heavy rope and steel rigging, moved along with the job as the bridge grew. Men joked about it because jokes were the only way to touch fear without letting it touch you back. On a cold morning, a rigger named Cal Murphy stepped onto a brace slick with mist. He was carrying a tool bag and a short length of cable, eyes on a swinging load coming in from the derrick. He didn't see his own heel lose traction until it was already gone. His body dropped cleanly, arms windmilling once, the tool bag tearing free and tumbling after him. For a heartbeat, the only sound was wind. Then the net caught him with a brutal elastic punch. The impact didn't feel like rescue. It felt like being hit by the ground, only the ground moved. The mesh sagged under his weight and sprang back, rolling him to one side. Cal coughed hard and tasted metal. His elbows and ribs lit up with pain. But he was alive, staring up at a lattice of steel where he'd just been standing. Above, men shouted and pointed. Not panic, procedure. Two workers clipped in and climbed down a ladder line to the net's edge, boots testing each step because you don't rush on something that has already proven it can take you. "Stay still," one of them yelled, as if stillness could undo gravity. Cal tried to laugh and it came out as a wheeze. He lifted one hand to show he could. The men hauled him toward a retrieval point, using ropes like fishermen pulling in something heavy and fighting. When they finally got him onto a platform, he sat hunched over, shaking, face grey under grime. A foreman looked him over the way foremen do. Half relief, half calculation. "You can stand?" Cal forced himself upright, legs unsteady. "Yeah," he lied, because men lie about pain when pain threatens their pay. The foreman nodded once, satisfied by the appearance of function. Then he looked past Cal to the work still moving above them. Back to it. That sentence was the bridge's heartbeat. Back to it. By the end of the week, there were more saves. A carpenter slipped off a narrow plank and hit the net hard enough to bruise his spine. A connector lost balance when a gust hit a hanging beam and he went over, caught by mesh instead of water. Each time the net did what it was designed to do, turn a death into a story you could survive. And the survivors did what people always do when they escape the void. They tried to make meaning out of it. They started calling themselves the Halfway to Hell Club. Not because it sounded brave, but because it sounded honest. In the bunkhouses, the men would clap a newcomer on the shoulder and ask, dead serious, "You been in the net yet?" If the answer was yes, you got a grin and a place at the table. If the answer was no, you got a look that said, "Your time is coming. I want you to notice what's happening here." The net didn't just save bodies, it created a narrative. It gave the newspapers a clean angle, innovation, safety, progress. Proof that engineering wasn't only about steel, but about responsibility. Visitors came to the site and stared down through fog, pointing at the mesh as if it were a guarantee. But the men on the bridge knew guarantees have borders. The net didn't cover everything. Loads swung outside it. Some work happened beyond its reach. And the bay wasn't the only way to die. A cable could whip, a rivet could blind, a plank could split, a man could slip and hit steel instead of net. The bridge kept its own tally in bruises and missing teeth, and days when the joke stopped being funny. Cal Murphy went back up 2 days later with bandages under his shirt and a stiffness in his walk he pretended was nothing. He avoided looking down, not because he feared the water now, but because he feared the comfort of thinking the net made him safe. Comfort is what makes men careless. Over time, the net saved 19 men. 19 second chances, 19 names that didn't become headlines. On the surface, it looked like the future had arrived on a cable, and yet, up on that steel, the wind kept blowing like it didn't care about inventions. The schedule kept pressing like it didn't care about funerals. The bridge kept rising like it expected sacrifice, net or no net. Subscribe and hit like, because the safety story everyone loves is real, and the reason it became legend is the one day it proved it had limits. The net turned the job into a strange kind of gambling house. Men would walk out onto wet steel with wind tugging at their clothes, and the question wasn't will someone fall? The question was where will they fall? Because the net only meant something if it was under you at the exact second your boot betrayed you. Some days the fog came in so thick the tower tops vanished. You could hear rivet guns hammering somewhere above you and never see the men holding them. Catwalks sweated moisture. Handrails felt slick. Every surface was a reminder that the bridge wasn't a solid thing yet. It was a series of narrow decisions suspended over water. Cal Murphy went back up with bruises that never really warmed up again. He moved like a man who'd learned the difference between being saved and being safe. He kept his eyes on the steel and his hands on something solid whenever he could. That was the quiet lesson of the Halfway to Hell Club. The net caught you once, and then you spent the rest of your days trying not to need it again. But the job didn't let men avoid it. The work moved. The net moved with it, slung beneath sections of the span, re-rigged and shifted as crews advanced. It was a logistical miracle on its own, and it invited a kind of confidence that was almost dangerous. Visitors started showing up at the edge of the site more often. Engineers, city officials, men with clean shoes who nodded and smiled at the idea of modern safety. Someone would point down into the fog and say, "That's the net," like naming it made it a shield. I'm going to say something blunt. When a mega project finds a safety innovation, it doesn't just protect workers, it protects the story. It gives the public a reason to believe this time is different. Up on the steel, the workers didn't feel different. They felt watched. Not just by foremen and timekeepers, but by the idea of being a symbol. It changes the way a job handles accidents. Everything becomes an optics problem first. A rigger named Louis Parks learned that on a wind-heavy afternoon when a load came in swinging wider than it should. The derrick was steady, the cable was steady, but the wind grabbed the beam like a hand and pulled it offline. The tagline snapped tight. The beam drifted toward the edge where men were working a narrow run of catwalk. Someone yelled, "Heads!" The warning arrived at the same time as the beam's shadow. Louis tried to step back, heels skidding on wet plank. He didn't fall outward, he fell sideways, shoulder clipping a rail, knees going over the edge. For a fraction of a second, he was suspended in nothing. Then he dropped into the net. The impact hit him like a fist. The net sagged and snapped, and Louis's scream came out as a cough when the air punched out of his chest. He lay there stunned, arms spread, staring up at the underside of the bridge as if the bridge had flipped him over like a coin. Above, the work didn't stop. It couldn't. The beam still needed to be set, and a swinging load is a death sentence for anyone standing nearby. Foreman shouted not at the fallen man but at the hook. "Hold it! Hold it! Bolt it!" 2 men climbed down to retrieve Louis, clipped into safety lines, moving like they'd rehearsed it, because in truth they had. The net wasn't an emergency plan. It was part of the daily workflow. Louis was hauled back up, shaking, face grey. He tried to grin through it because that's what the club demanded. Someone clapped him on the back too hard and he winced. Somebody else said, "Halfway, Louis," and the men laughed because laughing was how you stopped your hands from trembling. Then the bridge reminded them that the net wasn't the whole story. Later that week, a cable whipped. It wasn't a dramatic snap that cut the world in half. It was a sudden release under tension, a line shifting in a way nobody predicted because fatigue and haste had met at the wrong moment. The cable flicked like a struck snake and caught a worker across the forearm, opening skin in a clean, shocking tear. Blood sprayed dark against grey steel. The man, Frank D'Angelo, staggered back, eyes wide, teeth clenched, trying not to scream because screaming is what you do when you're dying. He wasn't falling, he was bleeding. The net couldn't catch that. They wrapped the arm with cloth tighter and tighter until the cloth went red. A foreman told him, "Down the tower, not the outside ladders," and it wasn't about ease. It was about sight lines. Keep the injury inside, keep the public from seeing the bridge bleed. And then there were the deaths the net could never touch, no matter how good it was. A man could be standing under the wrong point when a tool slipped. A rivet could drop, A bolt could bounce, a plank could tilt, and if the fall wasn't toward the net, if it was toward steel or toward a lower platform outside the mesh, there was no second chance. The bay wasn't the only bottom. Sometimes the bridge itself was. One morning, fog thick as wool, a labourer lost his footing on a wet catwalk outside the net's reach. Not over the bay, into the structure. He hit steel hard enough that the sound travelled through the span like a struck bell. Men nearest to him froze, then moved with the same controlled urgency they use for a swinging load. Stabilise the scene, clear the path, get him out of view. They didn't say his name loudly. Names invite questions. A supervisor arrived and did what supervisors did more often now. He looked outward first, toward the edge where visitors might be. He checked who could see. Then he spoke low to the foreman, and the foreman spoke low to the men. Back to it. It wasn't cruelty. It was a decision the entire project had already made. Down in the bunkhouses, the Halfway to Hell Club kept growing. 19 saves, they'd eventually say, and the men wore that number like a badge, proof they'd been dropped and returned. They told stories of hitting the net and feeling their bones ring. They joked about being caught like fish. But the jokes were edged now because everyone understood the net's true nature. It was a brilliant invention. It was also a boundary line. A man's survival could depend on whether he fell 3 feet to the left or 3 feet to the right. And above all of it, wind, fog, swinging loads, blood wrapped in cloth, the bridge's safety story started to harden into something official. Not yet a lie, not yet a myth. Just a narrative taking shape faster than the steel. The men could feel it, the way you feel weather changing before the sky admits it. By the time the South Tower stopped looking like a skeleton and started looking like a landmark, the bridge had 2 lives. One life was public. Photographs, progress bulletins, men in hard hats smiling into fog, the headline-friendly promise that this mega-project had learned from the old ones. The safety net became the symbol, proof you could build something this dangerous without feeding the bay. The other life was private. Bruises that never made it into print, broken fingers wrapped and hidden, men limping down interior ladders so no one on the shoreline could watch them bleed. I'm James. This is where the safety story begins to harden into an official story. And once a story becomes official, the job stops reacting to accidents as accidents. It starts reacting to them as threats to the narrative. On the catwalks, the work got more precise and less forgiving. The farther they reached, the more the bridge felt like a living thing under tension. Wind tugging, cables humming, steel shifting in tiny ways that you could feel through your boots. The net moved beneath the span like a dark shadow, re-rigged as crews advanced, always trying to stay under the most dangerous work. That trying is important, because the net was not a blanket. It was a moving target. A timekeeper started showing up more often near the access ladders, not to help but to watch. Not with suspicion, more like a man watching a machine that must stay within certain limits. Foremen stopped letting men gather at the rail after a save. A fall into the net used to buy a minute of stunned silence. Now it bought orders. Clear the work. Get him up. No crowds. Back to it. And the rule about talking hardened too. A guard at the gate didn't need to threaten anyone. The threat was already understood. A reporter with a notebook would ask a question, and the men would look past him as if he was asking about the weather. Names were currency. You didn't spend them outside the fence. Cal Murphy saw the shift in tone after Louis Parks's net fall got mentioned in a small paper as a dramatic rescue. The article was upbeat, almost cheerful, innovation, courage, a symbol of progress. It didn't mention the bruises. It didn't mention Louis vomiting from the impact. It didn't mention the fact that the net only worked where it was. The next morning, a superintendent stood where everyone could see him and delivered a polite order that felt like a muzzle. If anyone asks, he said, you direct them to the office. You don't give statements, you don't give numbers, you don't give names. Then he nodded toward the net below them, as if it was the only detail worth remembering. That's what people need to know. Up on the steel, people didn't need to know anything. They needed to keep their footing. Fog rolled in thick for 3 days straight. The kind that makes sound travel wrong. The kind that turns distance into a guess. Men worked by feel. Hands on rail, boots testing planks, voices shouting warnings that arrived a heartbeat late. A rigger named Sam Bryce slipped near a junction and caught himself, but the catch cost him. He slammed ribs against a brace hard enough to steal his breath. The pain made him blink stars into existence. He sat for 1 second, trying to get air back. A foreman appeared instantly. "Up!" he barked. Sam shook his head, still fighting to breathe. The foreman leaned closer. "You sit, you get scared, you hesitate, you die. Up." Sam forced himself upright, face pale, eyes wet, and kept walking. That's how men survived, by being ordered through their own fear. Below, the net hung ready, and the public loved it. Visitors would stand at the edge of the site and point down into the fog, thrilled by the idea that the bridge had a built-in mercy. In the bunkhouses, the Halfway to Hell Club started sounding less like a joke and more like a contract. You could fall, you could hit the net, you could crawl back up and laugh if the net was there. And that's where the countdown began, even if no one said it out loud. The job entered its final messy phase, the phase where temporary platforms and staging mattered more than steel heroics. There were sections where crews had to work from suspended platforms, where loads had to be handled in awkward angles, where men relied on lumber and bolts and trust that had been strained for months. The net was still beneath them, but the work was stretching beyond the neat story the newspapers wanted. Cal overheard 2 supervisors arguing near a tool shed, voices low enough to be private but not low enough to be secret. "We're close," one said. "We can't afford a delay now." "We can't afford another headline either," the other replied. It wasn't the bay they feared in that moment. It was the story. That fear is what feeds rumours later. Some men, years afterward, would claim the real toll was higher than the number people repeat, more deaths than made it into neat tallies or papers. That's rumour, not a fact I'm asking you to swallow. But the reason it sticks is real. On big jobs, what gets counted depends on categories. A death on the steel is one kind of story. A man who never comes back after being carried off site becomes a different kind of story, and different stories get remembered differently. Then there's the darker urban legend that always attaches itself to mega-projects, the idea that bodies were left in the structure, sealed into concrete or buried inside work to keep the schedule. You'll hear that claim in different forms in different cities. Right now, treat it as what it usually is. A story people tell because it feels like the kind of cruelty a giant project could hide. The truth later is less theatrical and often more plausible. You don't need to hide a body in concrete to erase a person. Paperwork can do it quietly. On the bridge, none of that mattered day to day. What mattered was the next shift, the next gust, the next plank, and the net kept doing its job, until the job asked more of it than it was built to absorb. In the fog, men worked from a platform that hung beneath the span, loaded with lumber and tools and the weight of the final push. It creaked under movement. Bolts were checked, then checked again, because everyone knew the cruel difference between steel and temporary wood. Steel fails loudly. Temporary wood fails suddenly. A worker joked too loudly. "At least the net's there." No one laughed, because by then, everyone understood the real truth of the Golden Gate safety story. It wasn't a shield. It was a promise with conditions, and the closer the bridge got to completion, the closer they got to the day those conditions would be tested. The day the safety story broke started like any other day the bridge tried to swallow. Fog sat low, wind worrying the steel, men moving with that practiced tight focus that looks like confidence from far away and feels like tension up close. Below the span, a work platform hung where the job needed it. Temporary staging loaded with lumber, tools and men. It creaked, it flexed, it carried the last ugly tasks that don't make postcards. Up above, the bridge looked finished enough to fool the eye. Down on the platform it still felt unfinished enough to kill. Cal Murphy was on the catwalk when the sound changed. Not a scream, not an explosion. A sharp, wrong crack, wood under stress giving up all at once. Then the platform shifted in a way that didn't belong to normal movement. Men on it threw their weight instinctively, trying to stabilize something that had already decided to fall. For a split second, you could see the logic of it. Too much weight, one failure point, a chain reaction that doesn't care how experienced you are. Then the whole platform dropped. It didn't drift. It didn't sway. It fell like a trapdoor opening under 12 men at once. The net was below, and for an instant that should have been the end of the fear, because the net was the legend, the proof, the thing that made the Golden Gate different. But the platform didn't fall like a man. It fell like a battering ram. It hit the net and tore it open. Ropes snapped. Rigging screamed. The mesh that had caught 19 bodies didn't catch a collapsing structure loaded with timber and iron. The net split the way cloth splits under a knife, and the men fell through the wound it couldn't close. 12 silhouettes dropped into fog and open air. Some struck pieces of the falling wreckage. Some spun. Some didn't move at all, bodies stiff with shock, arms not even reaching. Then the bay took them. The sound that rose from the crews above wasn't one clean reaction. It was chaos layered on procedure. Men ran to the rail and stopped themselves at the last second because leaning out too far creates another fall. Foremen shouted orders that collided with each other. Somebody yelled for boats. Somebody yelled to stop work. Somebody else yelled to keep the span clear because panic spreads faster than commands. Cal gripped the steel so hard his hands cramped. He stared down through fog at a patch of water that had briefly turned into a graveyard. A tug or workboat was already moving in, small and urgent against the scale of the bridge. Men on deck threw lines, hauling at anything that moved. In that churning grey water, 2 workers surfaced and clung to debris long enough to be pulled aboard. 2 lives rescued out of 12 isn't a miracle. It's a reminder of how thin chance really is. 10 didn't come up. The bridge had finally done the one thing the safety net story promised it wouldn't. It had made a mass fall unavoidable. This is the moment the myth runs out of room. A net can save a man. It can't save you from a failure big enough to destroy the net itself. Safety isn't a badge you earn once. It's a system you have to keep intact. That day proved the system had limits, and those limits were paid in bodies. The immediate aftermath was brutally practical. The platform was gone, the net was torn. Work could not continue under the span with a ripped safety system, not because the project suddenly discovered tenderness, but because now the danger was too public to ignore. The bay had taken 10 men in one morning. You can't reroute that around a headline. Men were sent down interior paths. Injuries were moved out of sight lines. Names were spoken quietly. Not to hide them from compassion, but because saying a name out loud on a job like that feels like admitting the bridge knows you personally. Later, the number people repeat about the Golden Gate's construction deaths often lands at 11. That's the clean count that survives the decades. The net saved 19. The Halfway to Hell Club stayed as a dark joke that became history. And then this one day arrived and made the joke go quiet. And this is where the rumours always attach themselves. Some men, years later, would swear the true loss was higher than the numbers that became official. Treat that as rumour, but understand why it persists. Big projects don't only lose men in dramatic falls, they lose men in categories: injured on the job, dead later, carried off site, not counted the same, names misspelled, stories shortened, families paid and pushed away from questions. You don't need a hidden grave to end up with a number that feels too tidy. Then there's the urban legend that follows almost every megaproject like a shadow. The claim that workers were left in the structure, sealed into concrete or buried inside the build to keep the schedule. That story spreads because it feels like the kind of cruelty a giant job could hide. But technically and organisationally, it's the kind of myth that collapses under its own weight. Because hiding a body inside a structure doesn't just require coldness, it requires silence from dozens of witnesses, work stopping long enough to do it, and a level of risk to the project that a contractor wouldn't take when there are easier ways to make someone disappear from the story. The quieter truth is usually more believable. Paperwork and categories can erase a person without ever touching wet concrete. What the Golden Gate exposes, if you let it, is something darker than any myth. Innovation can be real and still not be enough. The net was a real leap forward. It saved 19 men who would have died. It changed the way the world talked about construction safety. But it didn't change the fundamental reality of men working in wind and fog, above open water on temporary platforms under schedule pressure. It didn't change the fact that one failure could be bigger than the safety measure designed to catch the smaller failures. That's why this bridge is such a perfect story for anyone who believes progress is a straight line upward. Progress is real, but it's also fragile. It can be torn open by a single day. If you want to be part of one community that refuses to let the human cost get smoothed into postcards, subscribe so we stay together here. Hit like if you think safety stories should include the days they fail, and comment this. When a project advertises innovation and protection, do you remember the invention, or the one day it proved it wasn't enough?